Hey everybody, I'm Big John, and this week on Liberty Lens, we're breaking down the government shutdown, Rand Paul's stand, and Donald Trump's push to kill the filibuster. After more than 40 days of chaos in Washington, the Senate finally broke the stalemate, passing a deal to reopen the government and extend funding into early 2026. But the fight isn't over. Trump is calling to end the filibuster. Rand Paul is defying him over what turned out to be hemp restrictions, and the House is already gearing up for another round of political theater. So before my friend Mike Maat and I dive in, let's talk about what this shutdown, this filibuster battle, and this budget deal really mean for your freedom, your wallet, and the future of limited government in America. You're watching Liberty Lens, everyone, with me, your host, Big John, and my friend and former, coincidentally, VP nominee in 2024 for the Libertarian Party, now a member of the Republican Liberty Caucus, Mr. Mike Maat. Mike, how are you doing tonight?
Good. It's great to be with you. And the government is reopening. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. It's a weird thing, but it's good to be with you on this day.
Yes, it is. And, that's a great point you brought up, because before we get into the nitty gritty, I wanted to ask you what your sense of, you're a man of the people, you're out there, you're traveling the country, coming soon to a state near you, Mr. Mike Maat. But the truth of the matter is, what's been your sense of how the population in general has viewed this shutdown? Libertarians are like, hey, government shutdown, could be worse things that happened in this world.
There could be worse things.
Right. But there are real world consequences, right?
I wouldn't say I was missing it, as we used to say. Right.
But some people have felt the consequences, Mike. SNAP recipients, certain people who like new Medicaid applicants, Medicare issues, things of that nature, that really folks who are dependent, whether we think that's correct or not. But the reality is there are people dependent on government services to live, to survive. So in general, what do you think?
Like people who use airplanes.
That, yes, on a very non lethal or life dependent issue. You're right. We could get into that. But in general, what's your sense of, like, when you talk to folks out in society, out in the world, what's your sense?
My sense is that people are frustrated with how stupid people are in Washington. And as someone who used to work in Washington, I concur. There is no good defense of the behavior that's been going on in Washington. We can blame Republicans. We can blame Democrats. Personally, I lay this at the feet of Democrats this time, not that the Republicans have, covered themselves in glory, but clearly the Democrats had an opportunity to end this shutdown, and they decided not to do so in order to effectively bastardize the budget process. I think people are sincerely frustrated with both sides. I think it's logical for them to feel that way. To your point, there are a lot of reasons to not be upset that the government isn't out there wasting your money. But when it comes to programs on which people depend, right? This is not an effective way, a humane way. This is not a good way. This is not the American way to conduct business, to make policy, to run a government, right? You do not run a government by doing it stupidly for decades and then flipping off a light switch and thinking that that's, going to be effective in the long run at helping people deal with problems. One of the things that we complain about as libertarians is that social welfare programs create their own demand, right? They invite dependence.
Correct.
Now, a lot of folks believe in some sort of a social safety net. I agree with that, by the way. I believe that there should be a bit of a social safety net. I wish that the vast majority of that were in the private sector. But having said that, the way that we need to transition from what we have today to what we would want as libertarians is not to just fail to pass a continuing resolution and pretending that, I shouldn't say pretend. I don't think anyone should be pretending right now, but, failing to recognize that people are not going to just all of a sudden be able to adjust their lives, right?
Right.
This is a long exit path that needs to be pursued to change the way our government spends money. I think that we should pursue that, but failing to enact a continuing resolution and shutting down the government is just abject silliness.
I agree. And to some extent, Mike, would you agree that this is the macro, the bigger version of what initially happened with the Doge attempts at reform initially, right? Like Doge initially, you remember, came out of the gate gangbusters. Hey, we've identified these trillions in savings.
Right.
And it ended up being nothing by the end of the day. That actually got enacted, right? Because when you start unwinding special interests and then constituencies and actual people, like one of the things you typically see in these situations, Mike, is you'll see the say the Democrats and the lefties will say, you cut these services off, people will be dying in the streets. Then you hear the Republican or right wing say, these services exist for welfare queens who are driving around in caddies, but they're getting their SNAP payments to buy liquor or whatever. You know, you get the polar extremes.
Neither one is very true.
Exactly. It's the polar extremes, right?
Yep.
So somewhere in the middle, and again, libertarians have their own little role to play in this, right? Because you can't go from welfare state to Ancapistan overnight with any sort of social.
And importantly, your constituents can't.
Correct. So given now that we were here, and you're right, I think most people do seem to blame the Democrats, I think, this time around. I do agree with you there.
Well, the folks that take a hard look at the process, I understand that polling data is split depending on,
the source. Yeah, basically.
The source, right. But a whole lot of folks blame the Republicans because the Republicans are in control of the House, the Senate, and the White House. So that doesn't leave a whole lot of room for excuses, is how that logic goes.
Right. And what's interesting here is about 3-4 weeks ago on our sister program, Free for All, one of the guests asked me, like, if you were a Democrat, what would be your advice to them during the stalemate? And I said the best thing they could do is keep their mouths shut. Don't say anything.
Yeah.
Let the Republicans steer the ship, because politically, if they end up closing, hey, you're the minority party. What could you do? They control all three branches of government.
Right.
But if you open your mouth, you can make things a lot worse. So to that extent, do you agree that the Democrats may have politically, I'm saying, may have played this as best they could under the circumstances?
I think they played it as well as they could have. It might have been my advice to have gone along with the continuing resolution in the beginning, with a clean continuing resolution. I think one of the things that citizens of the United States are misled to believe is that continuing resolution means whatever it is your senator decides it means, right? A continuing resolution means a resolution to continue the government functioning the way that it has up until now without any policy decisions. In other words, we're going to set aside all of our arguments and just keep the government open. That's all it means, right?
Right.
And when you decide, well, I'm not going to vote for that unless we attach something to it, in the Democrats' case this year, it was an extension of the ACA subsidies that were put in place during COVID.
Right.
Okay. That's a weird thing, but we'll come back to that. You've in effect said, I don't believe in continuing resolutions, right? That's not a continuing resolution anymore. If you're saying I want a major policy change.
Right.
And so you've passed up the opportunity to play ball the way that we have played ball in the past. By the way, this is not the first time the process has been bastardized, and both parties have done it. So I don't mean to suggest that the Democrats have come up with something so profoundly stupid that it's never been done before. But you, in effect, have said, I don't want the government to stay open. I want to shut it down because that's how important what it is that I'm negotiating for.
Right. So given that the Democrat, so what I think now also, but if we're focusing it in on the party in power, Republicans, MAGA, President Trump, there was also a lot of internal, or I shouldn't say, I was going to say internal infighting, but that's repetitious, right? Repetitive. There was a lot of infighting within the GOP, right?
Yeah.
Now, the Senate, more so than the House.
Or at least some. I don't know what defines a lot, but there was some that matters. Yeah.
Some that matters. Let's say not insignificant amount of infighting.
Right.
And as is usually the case, the Senate tends to be more traditional, less open to political swings. They're there for a longer term than compared to the House. So whereas the House is all gangbusters, let's do what the president wants. The Senate is a little more reserved, right? We talked about it. This is probably because they know they're going to outlast any given president during their term, so they have to keep a lot more. They have a longer view in mind. To that
at least 2/3 of them will. Joni Ernst won't, but yeah, a lot of them will.
So to that extent, President Trump was pushing for the so-called nuclear option in the Senate.
Yep.
Change the rules to no longer require a 60-vote threshold to pass his agenda. Make it a simple majority. A few Republicans pushed back on that notion. Among them, the ever popular thorn in the president's side, Rand Paul from Kentucky, but also others, John Thune and others, said, "I don't know if we want to get to nuking the filibuster. Let's try to negotiate our way through this, because really the filibuster." Well, you tell me, Mike, why would several GOP senators, Paul, Thune, and others, I think there was 4 or 5 of them, that absolutely refused to give the president his nuclear option? Why do you think that is? Why would a Republican not back the president on the filibuster?
Well, there's a couple of different reasons, and I believe that they eventually will give it to him, by the way. That's my prediction. But at the moment, there are a couple of different things going on. One is just the culture element that you put your finger on a moment ago. The Senate believes itself to be more deliberative, is going to outlast the president, likes the way that things work. Where that comes from is the idea that if the minority party can block legislation with only 40 votes, which is the case today, right? That makes every senator a lot more important, even when he or she is out of the majority.
Right.
A lot of Republicans believe that they will be in the minority again someday, so long as their individual time horizon. You know, these are people that believe they're going to be elected time and again. So they're playing a long game relative to the White House. They figure it's completely possible they'll be in the minority again, and they want to be able to shut things down with only 40 votes, just like the Democrats do now. So that's important. The other piece that's important is that there is a lot of pressure on the Senate, just like there is in the House. But to your point earlier, the House is very resistant to pressure against it when it wants to align with the president. There are senators that aren't that crazy about aligning with the president no matter what, right? They're not in the business of come hell or high water, we're going to ride this out with the White House. That's not how a lot of them think. That is how you need to think, however, if you're going to throw out this 100-year tradition of how the Senate runs just because the President of the United States tells you to.
Right.
That's a bunch of oranges being told what to do by an apple. So, will they? I believe that they will. To change the rule requires 2/3 vote. They're not going to get that.
Right.
But I do believe that they will pursue what folks have called the nuclear option, which is just to pass it 52-48, or if they don't get Rand Paul, you know, maybe it's 51-49, maybe it's 50-50, and JD Vance breaks the tie. But I believe that they will reinterpret the rules to say a simple majority can get rid of the supermajority rule. Let that sink in. That's a weird thing, but I believe that that is the path that they will eventually take. And that will diminish resistance to the White House agenda tremendously. If the Senate is able to able to pass bills toward the enactment of legislation based on a simple majority, based on a tie plus the vice president breaking the tie, and the House can do it also, and both houses of Congress come under a lot of pressure from the White House, well, you can see where this is going. The White House will have a much freer hand going forward. And the reason that matters is not simply because the president has things that he wants to do, but because much of what it is that the president wants to do is getting stymied once in a while, here, there, in some cases small, in some cases big, by the courts. Imagine a world in which the Supreme Court decides you don't have the authority, only Congress does, to enact taxes. Tariffs are a tax. We want you to shut down your tariff policy. In a world like that, all the White House has to do is go back to the House and Senate and say, I need a 51%, I need 50 plus 1 to give me the authority to enact tariffs. And if a supermajority is no longer required in the Senate, he'll get his way.
Now, Mike, having said that, which thank you, by the way, that's a good little roundup of why President Trump would want to get rid of the filibuster and why certain senators like Rand Paul want to keep it. Now, what's to speak in favor of keeping the filibuster? Aside from the personal power aspect, talk to me about minority rights. Talk to me about preservation of the individuals standing up against the majority.
Well, most of what matters is, unfortunately, the politics of it and how important senators think they are, because they're the ones that have to make this decision. In a perfect world, a lot of that feeling would come from the idea that we have to stand up for minorities in a democracy.
Right.
When the founders put together our Constitution, it was with the idea in mind that we didn't want a simple majority ruling the world, right? We didn't want to, of course, the political parties didn't exist then, but we didn't want, the founders really held in disdain the idea that a simple majority could boss around a 49% minority in the United States. In fact, it's an old tenet of libertarian thought. And remember, the founders were very, very libertarian, that you shouldn't even tolerate a 99% majority violating the rights of the 1%. Right. And that feeling permeates how the House has, how the Senate has worked. The idea that the minority party is important and represents a segment of the American population that has to be respected. So the idea that we need to stand up for minorities is built into that way of thinking. The other piece of the Constitution that is so critical is that one of the ways that we protect from a government gaining too much power, centralizing too much authority, and then going willy-nilly and running roughshod over our rights, is the separation of powers. To be able to pass legislation is a tricky thing in America. You need the House to agree, you need the White House to agree, you need the Senate to agree, and then you have to do all of that in a fashion that doesn't cause the courts to pitch a hissy fit. This is a fairly high bar to clear. The reason we believe in this, as I mentioned, is to prevent too much power from being in the hands of any one element. Well, if you diminish this in the Senate, as I mentioned before, because of the party structure, the wheels are greased. There's very little resistance to the White House getting whatever it wants.
Right. And to what you were saying earlier, this is why a lot of people, mainly libertarians, have always referred to democracies as the tyranny of the majority. You can't have two foxes and a hen voting on what's for dinner, right? Unless
one of the foxes wants to eat a sibling,
right? Exactly.
Yeah, the chicken is in deep trouble. This is exactly why Winston Churchill pointed out how bad democracies are. It's just that they're better than all the other forms of government.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
And why we went with a republic instead of a straight democracy.
Exactly.
You don't just want to sit around and have, a popular vote every time you want to make a new rule.
Right. And to the extent that every MAGA person who ever said to any Democrat, this isn't a democracy, it's a republic, this is what your words mean. When you say that, this is what it means. It means that 50 plus 1 does not get its way and does not get to lord over everyone else.
And
all right.
remember, you're exactly right. And remember that this is a bipartisan issue. It's not nonpartisan, but it's not only on one side or the other. Both sides would, in the environment in which we live today, either side would move to remove the filibuster. The Democrats had almost enough just a few years ago.
Yes.
And just decided that they weren't going to. But I don't believe it is the case that if the Democrats were in power today, they would be able to resist the temptation.
Right. People forget the Obama years that the vocal Republican minority prevented a lot of, I mean, certain things went through, but they also prevented a lot of President Obama's agenda from going through. As libertarians, grateful that they did. But that's why I always say it's astonishing to me, Mike, how people have very short memories in politics. It seems like you leave it to people like us to say, like, no, this has already happened. We don't need to do it again, right? We don't need.
Yeah, trust me. By the time the decade is out, it's going to happen a couple of more times.
Exactly. All right, so let's move on a little bit. So okay, now we understand why the filibuster, the president is so for it, and there's some Republican senators. Now, in the spotlight among these Republican senators is someone that libertarians like to consider a friend in terms of his philosophy, which is Senator Rand Paul from Kentucky. We often talk about Rand Paul in the Senate and Thomas Massie in the House as being two Kentuckians who have a libertarian streak to them.
And probably will be two of the only Republicans who vote against the continuing resolution.
Right, and who are, incidentally enough, being targeted for primarying by the president. So when you put all that together, let's talk about Rand Paul in this particular case. Rand Paul, even before this, was known for filibustering, old school filibustering, Mike, where you go and you hold the podium and you don't leave, you don't take bathroom breaks. Him and Cory Booker, I think, have become taken up that Robert Byrd tradition of the long filibuster, right? Okay, so Rand Paul, for the longest time, is saying, I don't want a continuing resolution that continues to add debt. He was very vocal against the one big beautiful bill. He was very vocal against this continuing resolution. But now we're seeing some reports. Maybe it wasn't him being voting with integrity or anything. Maybe it was for the more prurient interest of, I got to protect Kentucky hemp farmers. Maybe, and this, now you see a lot of politics targeting him, saying now it's out in the open. The only reason he wanted to defy President Trump is he didn't get his handout for Kentucky hemp farmers. Talk to me, Mike. How accurate is that?
I've heard that is not fair. He has been in support of hemp farmers for a long time. He does have hemp farmers in Kentucky. There are hemp farmers all over the United States. He is also not one of these guys. He's not quite as far off on the libertarian edge as his dad was.
Of course.
But he's very libertarian when it comes to decriminalizing cannabis derivatives. Let's call them that. They have been legal in the United States and snuck into what otherwise would be a clean continuing resolution. Snuck in by Republicans was this idea that the cannabis derivatives, not straight cannabis, but below a certain, I think it's below 0.03% or 0.3% THC, right?
Something like gummies for most people would be an example, right?
Gummies and certain vape products and things like this, that they would come under federal regulation. I believe that Rand is probably correct that handled a certain way, no reason to believe it would be handled any differently, the government could use this regulation to effectively shut down this industry of cannabis derivatives.
Right.
That's a potentially big deal economically, but it's also a big deal in terms of limiting folks' liberty, their ability to avail themselves of these products, whether for recreational use or medical use. We're talking about grown adults. We're not talking about letting kids use them. Rand is right that the government should not be sticking its nose into these markets, especially in a way that would kill them. And he's also right that if you were in favor of regulating to death this industry, at least have the debate out in the open. Don't sneak it in the middle of the night into what would otherwise be a continuing resolution.
Right.
We just spent 40 days mocking Democrats for bastardizing the continuing resolution by adding a policy change, right? For demanding that there be the insertion of the extension of the Obamacare subsidies without normal procedure for debate. And now the Republicans did exactly the same thing, but on a different issue. I think Rand should be pissed. And by the way, just because he's got 3 reasons to be pissed: the destruction of the industry, the means by which it's being done legislatively, and the fact that the government is spending too much money. The fact that he's got 3 reasons to be pissed off really shouldn't diminish any one of those 3. I don't think it's fair to say, well, he never really cared about the expenditure. It was just he's protecting farmers. I'm sorry. He's got 2 reasons to vote no. I think he's going to vote no.
Right. Exactly. And something else that came up as he was making the press rounds after his filibuster and his attempt to slow down the bill was he said, for a lot of these farmers, they turned to hemp production as a result of the president's tariff policies and as a result of them economically facing hardship unless they turn to this easy to grow product that they could get to market quickly without too much overhead. And so here's another reason why are we penalizing these people? We've already made them suffer under the weight of these taxes. Also,
there are examples of this. I don't know whether it's a huge wave, but it is weird to be beating on these people. You know, we have tariffs in place because we want things grown domestically, but we trash their market and we regulate it to death and then we kill it off. It's just the messaging is all messed up here. The Republicans need to get on the same page, in my view.
Exactly. So Rand now has been facing a whole bunch of the president's ire. Where do we think this goes now? He's like, how do you view him politically? Do you think he's, first of all, before we move on to the other stuff, do you think he suffers as a result of standing up to Trump? Massey is a different animal, right? I think politically. But Massey, I think, has a different sort of, yes, libertarianish, but probably more rabid political fan base, if I could put it like that, as opposed to Rand Paul, who has that base in Kentucky, but I don't know if it's as rabid or not. But Mike, you're more of a political insider than I am. Do you think Rand suffers because of this, because of the stand he took, or does it help him in some weird way?
I think it helps him tap into the Thomas Massey rabid constituency that you so eloquently described. You know, I think that is absolutely true. So I think it depends on what your strategy is. If your strategy is, you know, I need 25% support, but I need them to support me in a war, right?
Right.
Or if your strategy is I need 51% support, even if we only agree, you know, 63% of the time, that's a very different strategy. I hear a lot of frustration from Trump supporters regarding Senator Paul. No question about that. In that sense, what he's doing is very courageous, because there are folks inside the Republican Party who are frustrated with him, not even so much because of his policy stances, but just because of his vote not giving President Trump his way all the time. So this is a big challenge for him. In the backdrop is the issue, will Rand Paul run for president?
Right.
Assuming that he does, he certainly has done what's necessary to carve out a very specific libertarian-ish lane, lowercase l, libertarian-ish lane. In that sense, good for him. If he's intent on running a message campaign, if he's intent on making a point, if he's intent on being his father's son in this regard, he's on the right track. If, on the other hand, he actually thinks that he could win and become president of the United States,
right,
I think he's on a dangerous path. I think he's on a collision course with reality. I personally would like to see him run for president, stay as principled as possible, and move the party in his direction. I would like to see him go to battle over these ideas.
Yeah, so would I actually, but it'd be interesting to see how it actually manifests itself, which obviously involves remaining in the Senate. I'm not sure when his term comes up exactly, but you could be sure that MAGA has a long memory, and I'm sure J.D. Vance will be there to remind folks that both Rand Paul and Massey did not support President Trump 100% of the time. Although, ironically, they do end up supporting him something like 90% of the time. It's still a very high.
Not enough. It's not enough. Well, so, look, when you're cutting it close, you know, in a Senate is 53-47, right? Every vote matters. That's a tough one.
Well, even to advance the spending bill, they got exactly 60.
They lost Rand. They held in there with 52 Republicans. They got 8 Democrats and hit 60 on the nose. That's a tough thing. If you only get 7 Democrats, you're in a world of trouble.
Now here's the thing. Talk to me about the minority politics of this. The 8 Democrats, among them someone who might be running for president on the Democrat side, John Fetterman. Talk to me about that the machinations involved in 8 Democrats defecting from Schumer.
Yep.
To support the president.
A lot of them are not standing for re-election. That's important. So in that sense, they get to vote their conscience and not worry too much about the politics. On some level, you got to say good for them, right? You know, they're making relatively courageous votes. I would say the same thing to Fetterman that I would say to Rand Paul. If you're going to run for president, you got to make up your mind. If you're pursuing a policy, a strategy, a campaign strategy that says, I'm going after 25%, but I want that 25% to stick with me come hell or high water, maybe over the next decade, through a real policy battle. Okay, right. I get it. Good for you. You do you. I like that on some level, right? On the other hand, if you actually think you're going to win the presidency wearing a sweatshirt,
right, right, and shorts and running, yeah,
and shorts and writing books and tell all of which I respect,
right?
But if you think that that's the path to the White House, I'm afraid you also may be on a collision course with reality,
right?
So I would encourage you to pursue the 25% ride or die with John and make that a message campaign intended to shift the debate inside the Democratic Party.
All right, that's saying a lot there, but it is interesting to me how these things shift, because on some level, it kind of hardens what you said, that in the Senate you actually have to get to some form of compromise in order to move forward. It can't be 100% partisan, right? Because it's very tough to get those 60 votes. And in this case, they needed 8 Democrats to defect because they even lost one of their own, right? So that does indicate that.
And remember, the Democrats aren't going along with this because they had, a big libertarian moment or a big Republican moment or a big conservative moment. No. None of that. None of that. The Democrats collapsed because they believe that by keeping the government closed, they were inflicting so much pain on so many millions of Americans. I'm not suggesting they were wrong, that it was an unethical thing to do. That's where they're coming from. They do not represent a shift in thought in the Democratic Party. They only represent a departure from Chuck Schumer's strategy. That's all this is about. So for those of us who are pining for the day when a libertarian wing is developed inside the Democratic Party, we can remain disappointed.
Okay. Yeah, you did. I didn't get that sense either. To your point, I think it might even be a little bit less even integrity driven as by imposing pain on people. I think their voters, they risked their voters leaving them over this, because if you're not going to help me with my SNAP benefits, if you're not going to help me with the Medicaid applications or anything like that, why do I need you? I can get ignored by the Republicans just as easily.
Now, there are several of them that are not facing a re-election. They're retiring.
Right.
But yeah, for the couple, maybe Fetterman is in this category. Maybe Fetterman believes that it's the politically expedient thing to do. He's already branded himself as a bit of a departure from someone who would just blindly follow party leadership. So maybe he figures it helps his brand.
Fair enough. Okay, now the last thing I want to talk about, the continuing resolution being moved out of the Senate, is the ACA subsidies. We said that was the main sticking point for the Democrats. They tried to stick in a policy change. So there is no ACA subsidy extension in this resolution that moved out of the Senate.
Right.
But you keep reading that the Democrats, in order for the ones that defected, so to speak, for that, they got a promise that the issue will be revisited in January 2026.
Yep. Around the corner in a few weeks.
Right. Do you feel that is just, that was, I'll say anything to get this deal done on the Republican side, or do you feel that there will actually be a revisit of this in January?
Yeah, both. I mean, they can give him the vote. I don't think Thune wants to give him the vote. He may feel morally obliged because they came to an agreement with Schumer. By the way, Schumer was in the agreement but didn't vote with them. That's a weird thing. I don't think Thune wants to give him Senate Majority Leader Thune wants to give him the vote, but I think he probably will. The vote won't pass. It'll be voted down on party lines, and that'll be the end of it. And so at the end of the day, I think you'll be able to say the Democrats got nothing for all of this lift of shutting down the government, refusing to capitulate to the Republicans' demands, and then eventually 8 defections caved. This whole 40-day saga will have been for nothing. And that's because it was ill-conceived from the beginning. It was not a good strategy. It was pursued ham-handedly. And now here we are.
Indeed, here we are. And
having said that, there's a really good chance the government's going to get shut down again. If, for example, what happens if Thune doesn't give him the vote? Right? I think he will. What if he doesn't? And those 8 Democratic senators decide they've been stabbed in the back, because that's all they negotiated for. That's all they were given in the negotiation.
Right.
Was a promise of a vote. Suppose that they don't get the vote, or suppose they do get the vote and it goes the wrong way, and now they're feeling hurt, right? One way or another, what happens if these 8 defectors, let's call them, these 8 Democrats, what if they feel hurt and they say, you know what? I'm reversing my defection. Uh-oh. Government gets shut down all over again.
Right.
This could happen. The other thing that could happen is that some of those defections get reversed for more substantial reasons, meaning things that the Republicans stick into the continuing resolution. What happens if one of those 8 is like Senator Paul and is upset about the cannabis-related derivative products? What happens if one of them wakes up one day and decides he or she is fiscally conservative? Or the issue that you and I haven't talked about yet, what if one of them wakes up one day and decides they're pissed off about language that the Republicans shoved in the continuing resolution that allows the senators to sue for damages because they're upset about the Justice Department having, pursuant to subpoena, looked at their telephone records when the Russiagate investigation was going on, and the January 6th investigation was going on. That language was shoved in there by Republicans, creating a new class of citizens called senators of the United States, who have a different legal vehicle than the rest of us. If a special investigator, special counsel comes after you or me without telling us, but with a subpoena and looks at our phone records, that's just tough for you and me, right? We can make a Fourth Amendment case, but we're going to lose it. Case law has already tested this. You're not required. Law enforcement is not required. Now, we can argue that law enforcement should be required, but under case law today, law enforcement is not required to inform you, John,
that
if they have a subpoena, that they are looking at your phone records, not the content of the conversations, not talking about wiretaps, just talking about your phone records. Well, now if you're a senator, you have a different legal status, an elevated legal status.
Right.
You're allowed to sue for this if you believe that your Fourth Amendment rights have been violated. 2 things can be true at once. Number 1, we shouldn't have bad investigations looking at senators without telling them, pulling phone records, and breaching what I think ought to be some confidentiality between senators and the President of the United States. Okay, we can debate that. There are 2 sides to that story. Set that aside for just a moment. What we should all agree on, the other thing that really is true, is that we should not be creating a new class of citizens in the Senate that has different protections of their constitutional rights than the rest of us.
That is 100% a certainty.
If you and I can live with nothing but the Fourth Amendment, so can those fools.
Oh, without a doubt. Without a doubt. Yeah. I wasn't necessarily aware of that language, and I'm glad you brought it up to both myself and our viewers, because again, it's that concept of the elite class. And if anyone for a second thought that the swamp was being drained with this new administration, maybe this is just another thing to throw on the evidence list that it's not. It's more of the same. Even if you feel you're slighted, the recourse is to not give yourself rights that others do not have, right? Not to grant yourself
it's
rights.
funny because I agree that we should all be fighting the swamp monster. But this feels like, oh yeah, you're a swamp monster? I'm a bigger swamp monster. Like, I can be slimier than you, right? And that's not the direction in which we want to go.
I agree.
As a matter of fact, the bill language says that they're able to sue for up to $500,000. Now, I recognize that one could argue that that's really a cap, right? The cap was put there so this doesn't get out of control, is the counter argument. But when you write language that says you can sue for up to $500,000, it really smacks of, gee, I wish someone had looked at my phone records without telling me, giving me the chance to sue in court, right? I could use 500 large. That's how it feels. I'm almost sure that was not the intention of the people who drafted this language.
Or maybe it was. You never know.
Feels that way.
Well, it's still very weird to me that you would take that path to correct the wrong as opposed to, say, passing some sort of law that says any conversation between a president and a member of Congress is to be considered privileged conversation or something to that effect. Might have been a more effective cure for this as opposed to
set the bar a little higher in terms of what a subpoena is able to do, for example.
Yeah, exactly. Get the equivalent of what you had to do as a cop to
or
get.
How about this? Right. Or how about this? If you're going to subpoena phone records for an American citizen, you tell him, even if he's not a senator.
They're aware that their metadata is being looked at.
Yeah, give us the same rights.
I agree with you 100%. And you know what? That seems like the perfect rallying cry to end this episode. Give us our rights. That sounds like something we should end the show on, Mike.
If we can't have all of our rights, at least make us feel like we're as protected by the Constitution as those fools in Washington protect themselves.
That sounds like the perfect closing. You're absolutely right. I want to thank everyone out there for joining us for this episode of Liberty Lens on the filibuster and the shutdown and the passing of the CR from the Senate. I thank you for joining us. Join us every week right here at Distant Warrior for Liberty Lens. For myself, Big John, and my co-host, Mr. Mike Termat, we'll catch you again next week with another interesting topic.